Hello, students. Well, we're going to look at another short story today, and it's one of my absolute favorites. I love this writer. His name is Saki. He writes really kind of unusual stories like the ones we have been reading, and his stories at the end always have kind of a, what was that kind of detail. So the standards that we are going to be looking at again today, we're going to look at RL, Reading Literature 8.1, which is citing textual evidence, and we've been looking at that for quite a while, and so you should hopefully be on the road to mastery for that. Today also we're going to look at RL 8.6, which is analyzing characters and reader's perspective. So we're going to look at the perspective of the main character and one of the minor characters, and then we're going to compare that to our own perspective as we're reading. And we're going to discuss the differences in those two perspectives and what effects that the writer creates, maybe using humor or even empathy. And so we'll talk about that as we look at the story. We are going to read the story together. I'm going to read it with you today, as if we were actually lecturing and discussing in class. So maybe we're in class, I don't know, I'm recording this summer, so we're going to do it together. So I'm going to be stopping, we're going to read part of the story, we're going to stop, and I'm going to throw some questions out there, and you really need to participate if you're doing this via video, so that you stay engaged with the story. So I'm going to try to share my screen. All right, so let's scroll up to the top, and you can find this link either if you want to open it up. I've linked the story directly to the website, or you can just follow along with this. It's up to you. So this story is called The Open Window by Saki, as I talked about. So I'm going to read, and I need you to really concentrate, and when I stop to ask questions, I want you to answer them mentally, and then we're going to have a discussion about it. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. So first I want us to talk about characterization, as I said, that we were looking at the standard on character perspective. So here we have what we call direct characterization. And direct characterization is where the writer describes or gives details to the reader directly about the character. So we have here a very self-possessed young lady. So Saki is describing her as self-possessed. What do you think that means, self-possessed? Well, look over in your side notes here that I've given you a copy of. It means composed or in control of one's feelings or actions. So the narrator, we assume so far, the person telling the story is in control of her actions. She's 15, a little bit older than most of you, and she's in control. And she says, in the meantime, you must try and put up with me. So is she trying to use humor here? You know, sometimes we will say, oh, I'm not very good at so-and-so, or you'll just have to listen to me today, or, you know, we're just trying to use a little bit of humor here to engage our audience, and the audience here is Mr. Nuttall. So let's learn more about Mr. Nuttall. Frampton Nuttall endeavored to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much toward helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. So here, indirect characterization, we see that Frampton is there. He sounds like he's kind of nervous. He's come to this establishment. We're not sure exactly what it is yet, for something to help his nerves, nerve cure, which he was supposed to be undergoing, nerves. Now, if we think about what we know about that phrase, we might have heard somebody say, "You're getting on my nerves." What does that mean? They're irritated, or they're not in the best mental state. We're not sure, but we will keep reading. Now, we do know that this 15-year-old young lady that we met in the first paragraph is the niece of the woman who was supposedly coming. So she's been sent there to maybe answer the door. Maybe your parents sometimes send you to the door, answer the door, see who's there. They'll be there in a second. That's what's going on here. I know how it will be, his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice. So Frampton's sister has given him some letters of introduction. Now that seems kind of strange for us. We do not do that here in the United States of America mostly. If you think about applying for like an overseas internship or something like that, like through Western or some educational institution, they would send details to like a host family, and they would say, you know, this is Melissa Joyner. She enjoys reading. She loves to study literature. She also loves grammar. It's kind of like an introduction. So that's what his sister, Frampton's sister, has done here, is given him a letter. And that letter will serve as like an introduction, especially since he seems kind of shy, because she says, we learn through his sister's words, again, indirect characterization, you will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul. So he seems like he's kind of a quiet, shy kind of man. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. So now we know the lady who owns this establishment, maybe it's a house, bed and breakfast, we're not sure yet, Mrs. Sappleton, and we've met her niece. Do you know many of the people around here? Asked the niece when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. So the two of them are sitting there, you know, waiting for her aunt, Mrs. Sappleton, to come in the room. They're not talking. And so she says, do you know many of the people here? Hardly a soul, says Frampton. My sister was staying here at the rectory. Look down to see what rectory means, house in which the minister of a parish lives. You know, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. So his sister has been here, but he doesn't know anyone. We're going to come back to this picture here. He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. What do you think that means? Let's make an inference here. Distinct regret. She gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. He's not really happy about having to meet new people. So remember back at the beginning of the story, we said he was kind of shy. So the textual evidence continues to support that. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt? Pursued the self-possessed young lady. Now let's look at that. Pursued the self-possessed young lady. Maybe some of you are pursuing the title of valedictorian when you get to be a senior at Bowling Green High. Or maybe you're going to pursue a degree in English and go on to be an English professor. Or pursue a degree in the evil math. Pursue, it's something you are after, right? Something that you actively seek. And then we have this description again of self-possessed young lady. So this characterization should be making us think, why is Saki using these words? As we talked about in the Monkey's Paw, writers deliberately choose their words. So let's keep this in mind. Only her name and address, admitted the caller, that's Mr. Nuttall. He was wondering whether Miss Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. Widow is someone whose husband has died. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. Habitation means to live in a place. So the room looks like there is some kind of male inhabitant or male person who lives there. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time. Her tragedy, asked Frampton, somehow in this restful country spot. Tragedies seemed out of place. You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. We would call that French doors. That's what they're calling a window. 2 French doors that open onto the lawn. It is quite warm for the time of year, said Frampton, but has the window got anything to do with the tragedy? Out through that window, 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here, the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. Poor Aunt always thinks that they will come back someday, they and the little brown spaniel that was lost within, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dark. Poor dear Aunt. She has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Bertie, why do you bound?" as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling they will all walk in through that window. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. Now, let's look. What is the reaction of Vera, the niece? What is her reaction to telling the story? What does the text say? Let's find some textual evidence. How does she react? Well, it says she broke off with a little shudder. What's a shudder? It's like, if we see something scary and we're like, that's a little shudder. And then for Frampton, it says it was a relief to Frampton. So maybe he was a little bit nervous. Remember, he's there for a nerve cure after all. So he's kind of a nervous person. And so maybe he's like, ugh. So he was relieved when Mrs. Sappleton came in. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. What do you think the word amusing means here? Hope she's been amusing you. Entertaining, right, we might say. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Miss Sappleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you men folk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. So he's sitting there watching Mrs. Sappleton, and she's like looking at the window, right, for her husband and her brothers. And he already knows the story because Vera has told him, right, of the tragedy while she was amusing him. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise, announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. What can we infer here about Frampton? He tells a lot of people about his illnesses, doesn't he? Makes us even wonder, does he really have this illness? He loves talking about illnesses. He's talking about what the doctor says. He's talking about his health. He just butts in right in, telling Mrs. Sappleton this, and on the supposed anniversary of this tragedy. I don't know. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement, he continued. So he just keeps on going on about his health. No, said Mrs. Sappleton in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. She's kind of bored. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. Here they are at last, she cried, just in time for tea. And don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes? Frampton shivered slightly and turned toward the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. So we see the fear in Vera's eyes, and now Frampton's going to start looking to see what he can see. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly, they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, I said, Bertie, why do you bound? Well, these details should be reminding you of what? The story that Vera had told Frampton. Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel door, drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. What did Frampton just do? He ran out the front door. He's running so quickly that he almost ran into a cyclist. Why is he running? He thinks he's seen a ghost. Here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white macintosh, coming in through the window. Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted out as we came in? A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Sappleton, could only talk about his illnesses and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost. Now, what do we know so far? Let's think about this. Was Mrs. Sappleton seeing things? Or are these people real? Let's read on. I expect it was the spaniel, said the niece calmly. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Romance at Short was her specialty. What? This is the last line of the story? What has just happened? Why is she talking about romance? It's not romance as in let me hold your hand, sweetie pie romance. It is not that kind of romance. It's romance as in mystery or adventure or heroic stories like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It's that kind of romance. So what has just happened? Vera made all of that up. She made up the story about the Mrs. Sappleton's husband and brothers. They were never dead. So let's go back. Let's go back in the story and find hints of where Saki is kind of letting us know this might be a story. So here she says, notice the niece here asked Frampton, do you know many of the people around here? So here she is finding out, does he know anyone? Why is she doing that? Because she needs to know if her story would be believable. And of course he says, hardly a soul, right? And then she says, then you practically know nothing about my aunt? So she's just making sure. And he says only her name and address. So here she starts her story. And notice she says it would be since your sister's time. So it's not, remember the sister had been there 4 years ago. So she's setting up that. Very clever is that she remembers self-possessed, in control. And then she goes on to tell the story. And then notice Mrs. Sappleton, when she comes in, I hope Vera has been amusing you. Amusing. Now we think of amusing as in entertaining, but also amusing is related to humor, right? And she carries it out, Vera carries it out, even with Vera's reaction. Notice here, the child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror. So she carries out her deliberate story to Frampton to a T. Remember, self-possessed, in control. And then she is so good that when the aunt is trying to figure out what caused Frampton to run out the door, she just very calmly comes up with another story to tell the aunt. Now, let's think about character perspective. Mrs. Sappleton's perspective, for example. You think she knows what Vera's done? No. We see that from the evidence of where she's trying to figure out why Frampton ran out the door. We don't know Frampton's mental situation. We were given hints that he has a nervous problem when he comes there. And so Vera, picks up on that to the extent that she's going to create this story either to, hey, I don't want him staying here, let's get rid of him this way, or, hey, I'm just kind of bored, let me just have some fun today, I'm going to tell some stories. You know, sometimes we see that in our world. People love rumors, unfortunately, and they make up stories for various reasons, but sometimes it's just They're trying to see if they can get by with it. And that's exactly what happens here. She does get by with it for whatever reason. If she's trying to get him to leave, if she's just trying to be funny, if she's going to go in her own room and just burst out laughing because, wow, we have done it again. Could she be a mischievous character? We see in The Telltale Heart, that character's perspective. You know, he was telling the story about the old man's eye. But had we learned about that story through the perspective of the old man, we might have had a different outlook on this story. We probably would have empathized greatly with the old man, right? Here we're empathizing, we think at first, with Mrs. Sappleton, but then we realize there's nothing wrong with Mrs. Sappleton. She has had no tragedy. And so by the end, are we kind of laughing along with Vera at Mr. Nuttall? Are we saying that Vera, she's so mean? Do we have empathy for Frampton? Do we have empathy for Vera? Maybe something has caused her to develop this need for embellishment, and some of us may call it just, lying. But or is it a game? Is it romance? I don't know. These are things about literature that, to me, make me love literature even more, because there is no clear-cut answer, really. We don't have the answers. The author did not give us all of the answers in the story. And that is kind of what a literary detective does, is he or she tries to figure out what was the author saying here. So let's scroll on down and look at, I always like to know a little bit about the writer. We see that Saki, his mother died, and he and his siblings were raised by their grandmother and two aunts. And notice this, although living with his strict and often bickering aunts was an unpleasant experience, it helped Saki develop the mischievous sense of humor that later made his writing famous. So we think this is kind of funny. It could be said to be creepy, right? All right, let's look at question number 1 here under talk about. Discuss Vera's character with a partner. Is she cruel, or is she basically harmless? Now, you could make a case for each of these. So if I gave you an extended response question, on a test, and it said something similar to this, you could look back, you could take both sides. You could say she's cruel, and then you could say she's basically harmless. You could say either one and develop a case. You would make your point in the first sentence. Then you would pull some textual evidence, and then you would discuss the textual evidence. You would explain it to your reader. What if I told you that the irony of Vera's name, the name Vera, when translated, means truth? Does that make you smile? It does me when I think about Saki's deliberate choice of names for his characters. Think about Mrs. Sappleton. Does she easily believe Vera's story? Sap. Think about Mr. Nuttall. Nut. So these character names are quite deliberately chosen. And Vera's, whose name means truth, is definitely not telling the truth in either of her stories, is she? Her story to Frampton is not the truth, and her story to her aunt at the end is not the truth. We have no evidence that he told her a story about being afraid of dogs. Okay. Let's look at question number 4. Think about Frampton's response when the hunters returned home. How might his response to this incident have kept Vera from getting in trouble? Had he not run out the door, what might have happened? He would have looked at Mrs. Sappleton and said, that girl right there, Vera, she has just made up this elaborate story. And she said all of you were dead. So Vera was taking quite the chance, wasn't she, in telling the story? What if he had not run? So she was taking a big gamble that he was going to react this way, wasn't she? Yes. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this story. Now, if you were thinking at the end what happened, okay, sometimes this happens to us, we're not sure, especially in stories, you know, by writers like O. Henry or Saki, when there's always some kind of surprise or twist. What you do is go back and you look at the language. You know how we talked about language, like words like amusing. And why was she asking the question about, did he know many people here? So seemingly insignificant details give us hints as to what happens at the end. So you have to be able to draw inferences by applying, you know, by looking at specific details throughout the story, right? Really looking at words and the effect of those words on the story. All right, so we're going to get ready to have a summative assessment, a test over these standards. So if you need to review any of the videos, you can. My best advice to you in preparing for this test is when you get the test, and I'll push it out through Google Classroom, I'm sorry, then you will just read the story carefully. It's going to be one story and some questions on one story that you have not read. And just read the story and think about the words. Do what we did today and read it slowly, take your time, and then look at what the question is asking. I'd really like for you to either take some notes about the question or write down the question's most important words, things like that. And then you can look at exactly what I'm trying to get at here. So that will be coming up, that will be your next assignment. I do have the video for the open window posted on the website as well. So it's very entertaining. I'd like for you to watch that. And you can think about the compare contrast standards that we've talked about. This video is very entertaining, and the character of Vera is done really well. So if you have any questions about anything, if we're not in school, then you can always email me. Otherwise, good luck on your test tomorrow. Thank you. Good luck.